So welcome, welcome, welcome. And what a fantastic response we've had to this webinar, which I think just underlines what a timely and important subject this is for the world of social housing in England. My name's Catherine Little. I'm a director at Campbell Tookell, and with my colleagues Kerry Victory Rowe and John Slade, we'll be facilitating today's session. We all lead much of Campbell Tookell's work around consumer regulation, amongst other things, and have been supporting providers across the world of housing associations and other RPs, as well as local authorities with retained stock. And it's a timely webinar, of course, with the publication of several documents, I'll say, Kate, several documents by the regulator on the 29th of February, which we've now had a chance to read and absorb. So today feels like a really important time to be talking about the revised approach to consumer standards. It's also, of course, hot on the heels of the soon-to-be statutory revised complaints handling code from the Housing Ombudsman, and so timely to be talking about that as well. We've got a poll up. Please do continue to fill that in for a moment, which suggests people are well on the way to preparation, a few nerves from some, and one person happy to put their hand up and say, actually, we're very well prepared. So a range of responses to that poll, I suppose. It is anonymous, I stress again. I think let's minimise the poll now, Zena, please, and if we can move on to the slides for the session. We're so pleased to have, how do I get rid of this poll? I do it myself. So pleased to have a range of providers within the room today. We have people from local authorities, from housing associations, other registered providers, as well as friends and colleagues from across the sector. And we're absolutely delighted to have such a stellar lineup of speakers for the webinar today. We'll come on in a moment to the plenary panel discussion, where Kate Dodsworth will open, Chief of Regulatory Engagement at the RSH, of course, to talk about changes to consumer regulation. We'll move on then to the Housing Ombudsman perspective, and Rick will speak as the Housing Ombudsman about his perspective on regulatory changes, as well as the complaints handling code. And then really pleased to have Yao Boateng join us. Yao is, we've put him as Deputy Chair of Stop Social Housing Stigma campaign. He is also extremely involved as Chair of the Tenant and Leaseholders Forum and involved in the Housing Improvement Board at his landlord, which is London Borough of Croydon. We will pause then after some questions and answers around 11 o'clock as we magically zoom you into 2 breakout sessions. And we've done that in order that local authorities and ALMOs can have space to talk about where you are, any particular issues you want to discuss, and housing associations and any other private registered providers can have your space to speak. We've got some good speakers for those workshops. I shall leave Kerry and John to introduce them when we get there. And then we will come back about 20 to 12 for some closing thoughts and just to sum up from what we've heard in the breakout sessions and the plenary. I'm really hoping now everyone can hear what's going on. Please do remain on mute. It's your choice as to whether to put your video on or not. But if you want to ask questions, please use the Q&A box to ask questions in this plenary session. If you can't see Q&A, click on More on the bottom of your screen, and there will be a Q&A box that you can pull up. What that allows you to do is ask questions so that I can see them and put them to the speakers. It also allows you to vote on questions. Now, I'll try and be a bit democratic, but I might use chair's privilege if I think there's some really interesting questions that we need to address with the speakers today. But please do use that box to ask questions and to vote on other people's questions. We'll try and keep an eye on the chat box as well. During the breakout session, we'll use the chat box just because of Zoom's functionality, and we are recording the webinar. If you'd rather have your camera off for that reason, please do. You can enable captions at the bottom of your screen if that's helpful to you. Finally, again, please stay on mute. We've got more than 200 people in the virtual room, and it just would be unmanageable to have people kind of chipping in. So we'll ask you to stay on mute during the session. And I think we will skip over the next slide, Zena, which just asks people to complete a poll that most people have done. And without any further ado, I will introduce Kate Dodsworth to start our plenary session. Kate, over to you.
Thanks, Catherine, and good morning, everyone. It's really, really good to be with you this morning. I'm going to talk for about 15 or 20 minutes and then hand over to Rick. And apologies to anyone who's sort of seen me speak in the last week or so. I've recognised some names there. It won't have changed an awful lot, which I suppose is a good thing. I was looking at the chat as it was coming through, and some of you that were having sound problems, I did see somebody had put that they had just exited, and I read that as "I'm just excited," which is a very odd introduction to a piece on regulation, but nevertheless, I think a lot of people are quite excited about April the 1st. And of course, our regulatory remit, our new regulatory remit, goes live from April the 1st. I think some of that is around managing expectations. What goes live on the 1st of April is, of course, our new consumer standards and our remit to regulate against those. But we have a 4-year programme of inspections. And unless things come up through the responsive route, it is going to take time to get through the sector. So from the 1st of April, I think for those that think everything is going to change and it's going to be incredibly dramatic, it might be a disappointment, but that is when we go live, our new remit starts, and we begin our programmed inspections. Not helpful, of course, it's April Fool's Day or Easter Monday. I prefer to focus on April the 2nd. Now, there's hundreds of you today from different sectors and different roles. And of course, the fundamental difference for housing associations, for PRPs, is that we continue to regulate against our economic standards to check financial viability and how organisations are being run. For local authorities, it's just consumer regulation. But I think for the whole sector, it is undoubtedly true that there are a number of challenges, complexities in delivering services and managing organisations at the moment. For anyone that read our sector risk analysis at the end of last year, you will have seen a number of economic risks around supply chain, recruitment, delivery of contracts, a whole range of issues for people to worry about. And of course, on top of that comes new regulation. Sometimes I think when the environment is incredibly complex and there's lots of things bombarding you, it's helpful to just come back to basics and to first principles. And I make no apology for starting really with the vision of what we are trying to achieve here through the new regulation. And that vision is really simple, straightforward, and should not be a million miles away from your core mission and purpose. And that is that tenants live in homes which are safe and of good quality, enjoy universally good landlord services, and have a relationship with their landlord that's underpinned by trust, transparency, and respect. And everything that we are trying to do through our regulation is about that vision. So I think that's really important. Now, our standards package, our definitive set of consumer standards, was published on the 29th of February. Another date, we always committed to get that out in February. Thank goodness it was a leap year. And you will have seen from that the definitive set of standards, the 4 consumer standards, our guidance around regulating the standards, and the code of practice. That, of course, is all up on the website, and I'm sure you're deep into that. But I think one of the important things to consider is from the consultation of our consumer standards that closed in October last year, there is no radical change. That doesn't mean to say that wasn't a good and open and effective consultation. The reason there is no radical change is the level of approval from all stakeholders of those consumer standards. partly because we've been trailing this for some time and the standards sort of sat closely with the themes of the white paper, but also I think we've been communicating pretty clearly with the sector and other stakeholders over the last few years. I don't think there were major surprises. And if I go a bit more granular into the detail of that consultation, we had over 1,000 responses. Over half of those responses were from tenants. That's really important. Tenants have been incredibly helpful and supportive to us in designing regulation about the things that matter to them. And the level of approval across the 4 standards that tenants group had was 88% to 95% across the 4, and other stakeholders weren't that far behind. So no radical change in terms of what you saw in the consultation. So those that have been doing their gap analysis against the consultation, that's a good place to start. There is a little bit more description, there is a little bit more consistency of language. There are a few more examples dotted around to help people out, but no radical change. I said that tenants have been important for us on this journey, and you'll have heard me say before that well over 3,000 tenants we've been talking to over the last 18 months or so. Too often tenants still talk about problems around communication and repairs and access to services, either physically, digitally, trying to get their problem resolved and not being heard, not being responded to, communication not being effective for second visits, all sorts of things which are reasonably basic in terms of some of the things that were coming back to us. We will continue to talk to tenants through our work over the next 4 years. We talk on a regular basis to umbrella bodies, and that's really helpful. But a new element, of course, for housing associations to the inspection, not least the consumer standards, but we will be talking to tenants as part of that. For local authorities, of course, we'll be regulating against the consumer standards and also talking to tenants. One of the reasons we will talk to tenants as part of the inspection is that on the transparency, influence and accountability standard, for instance, there is a piece in there about the ability for tenants to scrutinise performance. And one of the things we will want to do is observe a meeting such as the Tenant Scrutiny Committee and observe to make sure that those tenants have the tools to do the job. They have transparent information, up-to-date information, and then we can check through our work in the background that has read across to what boards or lead members are doing in terms of leading the organisation. In some cases, we reserve the right, if there's something serious that we need to investigate, we would reserve the right to do something like a focus group or a survey in order to talk to tenants more deeply about service. But for every inspection, it will be a case of observing a meeting to make sure that under the TINA standard, those tools are in place. Just to walk through an inspection very quickly. Standard notice is around 6 weeks. Those in the first quarter, early on in the first quarter, will have started to receive their letters now. Standard 6 weeks notice. We then have information at the office to triangulate. Some of that will be our own intelligence about providers, things that have come out through the year or through data. We will have a memorandum of understanding on a statutory footing with the Housing Ombudsman, and there may be information that is helpful to build a picture from the Housing Ombudsman. And of course, from the summer, we will have tenant satisfaction measures. So things to start building a picture about performance against our consumer standards. And then we will scope out with the provider that inspection and the areas of focus. We will send out for a whole range of documents that start to give us some evidence of assurance. And then we will come and do the field work. And it might be spaced out in terms of timing when we can sit and observe committees and do our field work and come in and talk to board, lead members, tenants, executive teams. We will then have a sort of close-up meeting with the landlord team and then come to an independent judgment. And just very quickly on the judgments, you can see this on the website, but in terms of our consumer regulation, we are talking about a C 1 to 4. Some of the language is quite muted. It isn't shout from the rooftops, we've got the t-shirt, we've got a golden cup here. This is the basics. This is the basics. You heard my vision at the start. This is the basics of what landlords want to achieve. They will want to do far more than the basics of regulation, but for us it's reasonably muted language. So a C1 will talk about overall meeting and delivering against the standards. A C2 will start to talk about some weaknesses that need to be addressed. A C3 will start to talk about serious failings, and C4 will talk about serious failings of a fundamental nature. Now, for landlords, particularly in that C3, C4 territory, they can then expect some really quite intensive engagement from us. The Act unleashed for us on a statutory footing new powers. We would always prefer to work with the landlord in order to make improvements for tenants and to put things right. We don't want to see resources diverted away from tenants by going straight in with the powers. And we will think about things like whether the landlord is able and willing to put things right, and we will want to engage with those and work with them until things are put right for tenants. Our responsive route will remain open, so referrals can be made to us at any time in the year. I expect that route will only widen with more emphasis on that and more knowledge of that. So tenants can refer to us at any point during the year, or there might be a referral that we pick up through the media or through something the Housing Ombudsman has told us, or a self-referral from the landlord. And we have built out our structure in order to really effectively triage those responsive cases, those referrals, to understand whether it is something that we need to get out, take action and do an inspection on the back of that, or whether it's something we can engage with the provider, get information, be satisfied and get assurance that way, or use as information for when we next come and inspect. So our responsive route will grow. And I think that the final thing I want to leave you with is just a couple of pointers. A lot of people say to me, does the regulator put out good practice? We're not in that space. We don't put out good practice. We regulate and leave the good practice to others. But some of the themes that come up time and time again, and we saw this when we went out for assurance on damp and mould, for instance, is the real urgent need for a mixture of good, effective culture that allows problems to be surfaced, allows people to pull the alarm and say, this isn't working well. The themes from our complaints or our satisfaction data or the data about stock quality are telling us something that we need to resolve. And marrying that up with the really effective quantitative data. So this is around systems, processes, one version of the truth, and culture that is led by boards and lead members and has a thread right through the organisation to give that leadership focus on things that matter to tenants. So a lot of people say to me, from April the 1st, what are we going to see? Where is the sector at? For that reason, that these are deep-rooted things that need to be surfaced, need to be dealt with and need to be resolved, and they won't take a day to do. I suspect we are not going to see large swathes of the sector in C1 territory. We've been very careful to get that message out to boards and to lead members around expectations. I think this is going to take some time, but the proof will be when we go out and inspect and start to kick the tires and see those results. And I, for one, am very much looking forward to about year 2, when we've got some good trend analysis, we've got some good themes. And of course, just my very final point, we are also doing a lot of work at the regulator to make sure that we give you the assurance that our judgments are effectively calibrated across the piece. We have got really good effective working between local authority teams, housing association teams, and we've got all the panels and the processes to make sure that our judgments are delivered with integrity, and we have safety nets to make sure that those processes are delivered properly. It might mean that we need some flex in the first year and that we do more inspections towards the end of the 4-year programme. So we build in some time for that looking looking at the gear stick, and we build in some time for the responsive route. But we've got that covered, and I want to give you that assurance from us as well. Right, I'm going to stop there. It's 25 past 10. I think we're pretty much on time. And I'm going to introduce Rick Blakeway, the Housing Ombudsman. Thank you.
Cool. Thanks so much, Kate. Absolute pleasure as always to follow you. So folks, I'm going to just touch on a few things around complaints, and also the interface perhaps between complaints and this evolving co-regulatory landscape. The main message or messages, I suppose, I want to get across to folk today is how complaints can help you navigate this perfect storm of pressures, operational pressures that you're experiencing, how they can provide assurance to both your board, but also the regulator and in this new settlement, and also how complaints can help strengthen both your culture and the landlord and tenant relationship. But to achieve all of those outcomes, you need to ensure that complaints aren't kind of put in a neat box on called complaint handling, and only viewed as complaint handling in isolation, only viewed in a quite transactional way. How many are we getting? How quickly are we dealing with them? And so on. It is about pivoting into a space where complaints are, you're using them to both look at the root causes and the potential learning that they provide, not only within your own organisation, the complaints that have occurred within your own organisation, not only the decisions that the Ombudsman makes, but across all of the information and insight that we provide as a service. Now, if you look back at the Social Housing Regulation Act, I think that direction of travel is articulated clearly in there in relation to the scope of the Ombudsman's work. So whilst the Complaint Handling Code itself is put on a statutory footing, and I'll come to that in a bit more detail in a moment, there are other measures in there for the Ombudsman to issue wider orders and good practice. And you've also seen it in the development of our scheme and development of our use of further investigation. So that's very much the direction of travel, and some of the things that we've been doing has now greater statutory recognition, and that's very much the development of our service as we go from what we've done in the last few years up to the 1st of April and the move towards proactive consumer regulation. So let me just touch on each of those provisions from the Act very briefly. So firstly, good practice. This is something which repeatedly we're asked for by the sector, and we will consult very shortly on the framework for issuing good practice. And as part of that consultation, we will ask landlords and residents what they would like to propose as areas for us to develop good practice based on our casework and good practice based on a dialogue with both landlords and residents. And our goal after the consultation on it, on the framework for good practice and the self-assessment against it, will be to issue our first good practice in the autumn. To give you an example of one of the proposals from us that will be in there is around compensation, how to reach appropriate remedies. We have guidance on this already, but we could go further in terms of how good practice could work and the thought process through which a provider can go to address that. Wider orders is the other area, is the next area, and that's something which has now been in our scheme following the Act since October. And this year we've issued 14,000 remedies as an Ombudsman this financial year. 88 of those remedies, those orders, have been wider orders. Now, what is a wider order? Because clearly some landlords will have received one, but others will think, well, what is this? And it's 54F in our scheme. So you can, if you go and look at the scheme, you can see the detail of it in that section. But the aim of a wider order is to do an effective root cause analysis of what led to the events in the case, and particularly where we can see that without a change in policy or practice, the same service failures could reoccur. The framework for wider orders when they are issued will include the review, the senior management review of the case being done independent of the service area, and potentially engaging independent expertise external to the landlord. It will involve considering other cases which may be within the landlord's process where the same issues have occurred, and it will include recommendations for service improvement, and those recommendations to be scrutinised by the board and for the board to have oversight on their delivery. So those are some of the elements. We try and be quite specific on some of the areas where we consider the landlord needs to address as part of the review. The analogy that I've used is that you'll have seen we write paragraph 49 reports, we call them, or reports which in relation to landlords where we've seen multiple similar reoccurring issues, and we attempt to join the dots through a special report that draws together casework over a period of time and makes specific recommendations. That's a process through which we go. In a sense, what this wider order seeks to achieve is to encourage the landlord itself to go through that process and produce its own report, which I think is a key element of the landlord embedding the recommendations from any learning exercise on a case. We will soon publish some of the decisions that we made in relation to wider orders, and I hope alongside the learning report that the landlord itself produced. And I think that will obviously help people to see that both, could this be us? Is what could we learn from it, as well as understand the process in more depth. But certainly the feedback that I've had from chief executives have been positive about the opportunity that it's provided to reflect and really, lift the bonnet and examine what's happening. So now, if I come to the complaint handling code, now look, this is a statutory document from the 1st of April, as you're all aware. It's been around for a few years. The big difference is that we will have a legal duty to monitor compliance with the code. So this moves it from individual complaints into landlords providing assurance to us that they are implementing the code, even where we do not receive complaints in relation to that landlord. So the self-assessment will need to be submitted, and we propose that it's submitted at the same time that the TSMs have to be produced. So there's a bit of alignment there. But when you look at the code, there'll be a huge amount of focus on, quite rightly, on timescales and stages and so on. But that's not the whole code. A lot of the code is about establishing a positive complaint handling culture. It's about engaging the organisation in learning from complaints, and it's about using complaints as that tool for service improvement. So those qualitative elements, they will be part of the monitoring duty that we have. They must be part of the self-assessment, and that is getting back to my point. Complaints are not just a transaction. Don't just put them in the box of complaint handling. Use them more, integrate them within your organisation. Because so often when I go and talk to boards and different landlords, I'll see mugs on the table in front of me, and often those mugs will have the values of the landlord, a value of the landlord are on there. And those values will be things like, we listen, we put things right, we want to achieve the best. And I think, well, your complaints are a good indicator on whether you listen, whether you put things right, whether you're achieving the best. And that's the space I really want complaints to move and work on complaints to go, because it can be such a valuable source of insight for your culture, your values, your behaviours as an organisation. And if I look at some of the cases that we've had recently, questions which I think those individual cases can raise will be, do staff understand a policy or process? Is that policy working? Why are there workarounds on the policy? What's driving that? Is a contractor performing? Is the contract itself the right one? Where are the gaps in data, records, or knowledge and information? If a new process has been introduced, is it working? Are the outcomes what were expected? Were there any unintended consequences? What's our communication like? Are there issues on the horizon that we, can identify through our complaints that we wouldn't see, maybe not pick up otherwise, and so on? There is so much, I think, that you can draw from complaints to inform that. And those cases which have covered fire doors being missing, the wrong inspection form for to identify asbestos, through to contractor underperformance, those are the kind of questions which I think those cases give rise to. But then there is the data, an area I know Campbell Tickle's very interested. But then there is the data that we have on complaints, and that continues to grow each year. Last month, we issued 600 determinations, more than 600 determinations. That would have been half a year's work for us as a service 4 years ago. That means that the case file we now have runs to thousands. We are heading towards a 10,000 investigation a year organisation. That is rich intelligence and rich insight. It means each year, the aggregate data will be much bigger. Look at it. Don't get too hung up on, was it this number of service failures versus this number of maladministrations? Don't get too hung up on it. Look at the themes arising from that, because I think I can clearly see consistent messages coming across, whether that's as a sector, or whether that's as individual landlords. Embrace those as an opportunity, an earlier opportunity to learn, which is where I'll finish, because I think I strongly suspect that if the regulator makes a regulatory judgment that involves a landlord not meeting the outcomes in the standards, I'd be surprised if there wasn't a complaint or a pattern in the complaints that could point to it. Might not always be the case. Not everything that goes wrong in complaints is going to lead to that kind of regulatory judgment, but probably there's something in the complaints that can indicate it. So look at the cases we've published today involving an individual landlord. Those are serious cases, significant compensation that's been paid in them. The decisions were made, and I'd just say shortly after those decisions, the landlord itself decided to self-refer to the regulator. Look at some of the other work that's happened over the last few years, where you've seen regulatory decisions following the complaints. Won't always happen. Things will always go wrong. It's just life. It's inevitable. But if there's something consistently not working that could ultimately lead to a regulatory action, I'm pretty certain your complaints will be that canary in the coal mine that could have been looked at. And I, want the social housing sector to be a tremendous success. It provides an invaluable service to residents and to society and the economy. And I really, really hope that complaints can support the sector to achieve those outcomes. Right, that's where I stop, and I hand over now to...
The name is Yao. Thanks, Catherine and Campbell Tickle, for inviting me. It's a pleasure. And just to give a brief summary of who I am. And the only reason being that the last time I made a presentation, I was told off for not mentioning other hats that I wear. So I'm a very involved resident. I'm the deputy chair for the Stop Social Housing Stigma campaign. And basically, just in summary, we started since 2017, I think, after the Grenfell Tower situation. And our main remit basically is to work to create a stigma-free social housing. Can I have the next slide, please? We've been involved in quite a lot of work, and just obviously I'm not here just purely for Stop Social Stigma. So if you need to know a bit more about us, I'm very glad that someone's put the correct sign for, I was going to say, I've forgotten what the name is now, but it's now called X. And that's our email address. And then the bottom one is the website. We are involved in quite a lot of exercises. And one important one that's happening at the moment is we're working with 2 academics. Can I have the next slide, please? And they have organized a survey, but the good thing about it is that they split it into tenants, contractors, and also providers. So I do wish that all people on this call could actually have a look at the survey and respond to it, because it would help inform the way this whole campaign does go. As I said, I'm a very involved resident. Apart from being chair of the tenancy leaseholder panel, I also sit on the complaints panel of Croydon Council, and also I'm a member of the Housing Improvement Board. And I'm sure Rick would be very happy to know that I have pleasure in reading the weekly newsletters that go out, and I do read with much surprise and amusement the maladministration cases. And I don't read them just to pick out, just to point fingers at, look at what this council is doing, what this landlord is doing. But one thing that does surprise me is that a lot of the maladministration cases are what I call basic cultural issues. One of the complaints we dealt with quite recently, just to cut long story short, what had happened is that the 2 officers dealing with the complaint had left the council. The complaint just left, it was just dead, so to speak. Resident wasn't informed, and when it actually came to light, the other officers realized that the officer dealing with the complaint had actually left. So the resident was none the wiser. The good thing about that is that recommendations were made, and what's happening now in Croydon Council is that whenever a complaint is registered, it goes into a central system where the corporate complaints department has put some triggers on it. So if after a certain time the complaint hasn't been actioned, then it triggers. So that helps that situation. I'm also very happy about the new regulatory system that's coming in place in April. But what I'm actually more focused on is, one of my roles is to just improve relationships between residents and the landlord, because at the end of the day, being a tenant, I don't have any choice to move to another provider. I'm there for life, so to speak, unless obviously I do something wrong. So if that's the case, then why don't I improve the relationship between myself, residents, and the landlords? And one thing that also, for me, is very important is that this whole change in the housing regulation kind of like speaks about a shift, or a paradigm shift, from resident exclusion to resident participation. And my view is that residents do need to be given a seat at the table of very important decision making, because you're going to sit in your office making a decision about a resident's community or where they live without involving the resident. I don't think that's a good idea, because at the end of the day, you might, as an officer, you might decide that something needs to change, but without speaking to the resident, how do you know that that's what the resident wants? I'll give you an example. In my estate, we had bike sheds littered around the whole estate because the mayor said that let's move to a clean air society and all that kind of stuff. Those bike sheds have been there for over 3 years, not being used. In my opinion, it's a waste of money. Things would have been better if, when that decision was made, you got hold of the residents who live in the area. How many residents use bikes? Would these sheds be of benefit to you? Those kind of questions. And sometimes what I ask myself is, why is it that some landlords do not involve residents? And I've been to quite a few different meetings and conferences, and I hear sometimes with utter shock that there are some, and this unfortunately is more with housing associations, where they've got residents on their panels, but they're just there as a figure, a number. They don't have any say in what happens. They're just there as a number. I do feel that residents do need to be given an active seat at the table of decision making. I'm not saying every decision making, but at least decisions that affect where they live, how they live, and their lifestyle. Some of the reasons I've got down here as to why some landlords might not involve residents, it could be, is it a fear of the truth being told? Because at the end of the day, if you want to know what's happening in an estate or in a community, you need to ask the residents. And sometimes it's the fear of being told that this is going wrong and being compelled to make a change. The other statement I've got here is that morality is not, you can't legalize morality, but you can expect it. As a council officer or as a landlord or as an officer, how would you feel moving a resident into a moldy, damp property? If that was your relative, just give that a thought. Can I have the next slide, please? What I'm actually asking for landlords and even residents is what I call the pause and reflect thing. Sometimes when you have a decision to make, just give yourself a couple of minutes to just pause and think about this very serious decision you're going to be making. Let's say if I was the officer who books residents into their new properties, the property is damp. How do I feel moving that resident into that property? Or sometimes what I've heard, and I don't know whether it's done deliberately or just by chance, contractors have moved into void properties, seen some defects and just plastered over them. Do you not realize that those defects are going to be complaints, and those complaints are just going to be escalated? And I've sat through and adjudicated on some of our complaints, and one of the ringing themes has been lack of communication. When I hear a complaint, I ask myself a few questions. Could this complaint have been avoided? What was done to mitigate the effects of this complaint? And sometimes it's just a mere factor of lack of communication. The left hand didn't tell the right hand what was happening, or the contractor moved in to do some repairs, saw something else needed to be done, didn't feed it back to the landlord, and therefore the resident is none the wiser. So my plea is just to give yourself a few moments. Yes, it's going to spend time, a few moments, just to think about your decisions that you make as officers to the residents. And if I could just have the last slide, please. One of my favorite sayings is always remember there's a human eye behind every KPI. Now, my initial reaction to KPIs was that, look, we don't need them. They just camouflage a lot of things that should have been done. But I do, having been very involved, I do realize the need for KPIs. And one of the credits I'll give to my landlord growing council, and that's a big shout, when we recently procured our repairs contracts, residents were involved at the very beginning. And I must say it was hard work. It was very fast paced, but I am glad that we actually sat through it and we learned a lot. Sometimes it just means that your policies or your processes need to be humanized, because some of these policies and processes were there since, let's say, 1970. Things have changed now. Families have grown. Things that used to be okay for that time are not okay in the year 2024. So just remember, as residents, as officers, as landlords, there is a human eye behind every KPI. And thank you.
Thanks, Yao, and thanks to all our speakers there. We've had a few questions come through in advance to the session today, as well as some coming through the chat as well. We will follow up today's session with a short briefing, just addressing some of the questions we don't get a chance to answer, for our speakers to answer today. So if we don't touch on your question, we'll try and address it in that briefing. I wanted to start off with a question we had in advance of the session, possibly starting with you, Kate, but I'd be interested in Rick and Yao's perspective too. And it's really around this question of, the extent to which providers are going to have everything completely ready on day one of the new consumer regulation regime, 1st of April. Have you got everything in place? And Kate, you addressed that, the kind of 4-year cycle of inspections. But the question is, what does well prepared for consumer inspection, and perhaps for the statutory complaints handling code, look like in the context for those organisations that will have the earliest inspections? Could I ask you, Kate, to address that briefly, and then I'll just see if Rick or Yao want to add anything.
Yeah, of course. And people have been asking me this quite a lot. Well, is it unfair on people sort of earlier on in the programme? I mean, I come back to that point that we've been trailing this for a long time. Green paper, white paper, bill and act, and now go live from April over a period of years. So I think there is a real clarity with the standards and the standards that people need to achieve. I think we have set out our expectations around there not being large swathes in the C1 territory, but we may be proved wrong. I don't know. But I think for those who are going to be inspected in the first year or the first 2 years, we are making an independent judgment on the evidence that we see in front of us at the time. And that's that, I can't sugarcoat that really anymore. This is an independent judgment of the evidence and assurance that we get against the standards at the time. And I recognise that maybe for some parts of the C gradings, a little more so than the G and the V gradings, there is the opportunity to sort of say nice words and jam tomorrow and everything else, but it is an independent judgment on what we see in front of us. And I think as we get into the cycle and move towards a second 4-year cycle, people will get used to that. But we have to look at what we see on the day.
Thanks, Kate. Rick, did you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, no one's going to be sufficiently prepared for the 1st of April. Because in a way, the 1st of April is the start. It's the latest phase, the latest chapter in something that's going to unfold over years. And if you look at my casework, the cornerstone of that is the Landlord and Tenant Act that's been around since the mid-1980s, and there's still some landlords trying to develop their approach and to the Landlord and Tenant Act. Things like Awab's Law will come along in the future. That will be another dynamic in all of this. So the picture just keeps unfolding, and landlords need to be agile and responsive to that rather than think, oh, we've crystallized everything, great. And I can understand that desire to try and bring that sort of stability in, but it's a journey, this in that hackneyed way. And just taking the complaint handling code, we did a desktop assessment to see whether we could find the self-assessments for landlords, because currently landlords are meant to publish their self-assessment, and that's been something around for about 3 years. And the majority of landlords in our sample had not published their self-assessment. They may have done it, but they hadn't published it. I suspect some may not have done it.
Thank you. I'm going to move on to another question, and it's kind of draws together a few things that have been raised in the chat today, but also in pre-questions. It's really about how inspections are going to work in practice, Kate. There's questions around how documents are going to be used to support regulatory judgment, and a question that's got a couple of upvotes around whether the judgment C3 or 4, so non-compliant with consumer standards, might have implications for the G or possibly even the B rating for housing associations. When you're talking, Kate, around inspection, I wonder as well if you want to draw out. I suppose it's inevitable, isn't it? When people talk about inspection, they might think of other regulators in other sectors and perhaps some of the events that have happened and lessons learned for Ofsted in particular on them. I wonder if you want to talk a little bit about then inspection in practice, the regulatory judgments, and any lessons learned from where regulators have had to make changes themselves.
We've got another hour.
In 2 minutes.
I'll do my best to be really brief on that. So in terms of the documents, that's a really important part of our inspection process, that sending out for documents beforehand, because it allows you as the landlord to start building that narrative and for us to start looking at evidence of assurance against the standard. So that's really important. Now, a lot of people have asked about the sort of matrix of judgment, particularly on the housing association side, where there is G, V and C. We haven't started yet. We'll see how that matrix works out as we go through the 4-year programme. But I think it is really unlikely if you have a spectrum where there is a C4 rating, for instance, where there is fundamentally serious problems. I think it is unlikely that you are going to see a G1 where the organisation is being run really well and there's great oversight of everything within there. That seems to me a step too far. Now, there might be some issues on the consumer side where there is something sort of bordered, something specific, something that the board or local councillors are really aware of. They're working through an action plan. That might be slightly different, but I cannot see how an organisation could be in C4 territory and then be extremely, well run on the G1 side. You asked about the impact and some overlap with some of the stuff that we've seen around Ofsted. I've only been at the regulator for nearly 3 years, so in effect, I'm the new girl. I've been in the sector operationally for 30 years. And one of the things that I really want to get across is that within the regulator, there is not this kind of sense of, oh, so-and-so's a terrible leader, that all gets very personal. We have complex problems that come in. We work with the providers as long as they are able and willing to quickly prioritise urgent issues, health and safety, and then work through whatever it is that has gone wrong as swiftly as possible and return them back out of our engagement so that those services are improved for tenants and tenants see the outcomes. I think the environment at the moment is really quite difficult. I think, with social media as well, there's very little nuances, either good or evil, and a lot of armchair experts. Much more complicated than it used to be 20 years ago. But I think for us, the culture is complex problems in, complex problems out, and improvements for tenants as quickly as possible. I hope that helps.
Thanks, Kate. And we do just about have 1 more minute left. So, Yao, I'm going to turn to you now. We heard from all 3 speakers about the importance of culture, the importance of the right culture, the right leadership. Rick, I love that line about the values on the mug. I tend to talk about values on a wall, and complaints being a real litmus test of what those values are in practice. Yao, from your perspective, what kind of things would you look for as indicators that organisational culture is right? And what do you think tenants might be looking for?
Okay. All right. Very briefly, I'm looking for the basics in a nutshell. And I'm one of these people, and one of the benefits of me having a very good deputy chair on the Tennessee leaseholder panel is that he's a details guy. I am what you call the basics guy. I just need to make sure that my residents or my fellow tenants are getting the basics services right. So from the regulator, I'm just looking for the basics Now, I know Kate mentioned about G's and F's and a host of other things. That does my head in. Not to say they're wrong, but it does my head in. So I'm just looking for all the basic. I'm looking when it comes to complaints, for example. I read through the complaint and I'm looking, have the basics been hidden or have they not been done? Because if you get the basics right, as far as I'm concerned, a lot of things fall into place. You can have the KPIs, but unless you've got the basic thing about the culture in the place, a complete paradigm shift, if needs be, then you're heading for an uphill battle.
Thanks, Yao. And I think there's a read across there in terms of kind of transparency and get the basics right is a good phrase to use. Can I thank Kate, Richard and Yao very much for your participation in this opening plenary. That's been really helpful. I can see a number of comments in the chat saying thank you as well. In a moment then, folks, you are going to be whisked away like Harry Potter disapparating or jumping into a flue or whatever he does to your breakout rooms. If you find you're not automatically placed in a room, please don't panic. Please just pop into the chat if you'd like to be in the housing association room or the local authority room, and we will sort that out. You're going to then be whisked off into your breakouts. My colleague John Slade will chair the local authorities room, and we have Paul Langford from Birmingham City Council, Kathy McArdle and Sarah Cartwright from Barnsley Council, and my colleague Kerry Victory Rowe will be facilitating the Housing Association and PRP room. Pleased to have Duncan Brown with us, dialing in, I think, from the Finance Conference in Liverpool. Thank you, Duncan, from Vivid. And Jessie Farjesman, who is chair of the NHS Smaller Housing Associations group. So hopefully that will pick up on some of the questions we've had in the chat with regards to smaller HAs. Richard, Kate, Yao, thanks again so much. Everyone, I don't know, turn around 3 times and you should be in your breakout room. Okay, I think we've got everyone back now. So welcome back. We're going to hear shortly about some of the themes that came up in the breakout sessions from my colleagues John and Kerry. Just before we do, I did want to say, if you have any questions that you feel haven't been answered yet within this masterclass, please do pop them into the Q&A box. Where we can, where there's themes and there's sufficient interest, we'll address those in the brief that we'll produce after this masterclass, and hopefully we can address some of the main queries, concerns, and hopes, who knows, that you want to raise in questions. We will also, at the end of the webinar, send you a brief survey just to get a sense of how you found this masterclass, any feedback, and that includes the opportunity to book a slot with one of us at CT if you wanted to chat any further around where you are or any particular concerns you want to chat over. However, enough from me. I'm going to come, I think, to John first, because you're not on mute, and ask you just to give a few minutes feedback on what you discussed in the room with local authorities. Over to you, John.
Thank you very much. Really interesting to hear from 2 different local authorities, 2 different sets of challenges. One of the local authorities with an ALMO, the other managing its own housing service. And I think one of my observations, so 2 main observations. It was really interesting to hear from 2 completely separate, unrelated authorities, and it was like we'd heard 2 choirs singing slightly different versions of the same song. So very similar experiences in terms of how the regulator engaged with them and what mattered to the regulator. And that speaks positively of, the degree of commonality that's going to go on, and the fact that what's good practice in one place is likely to be good practice in another. And I think another observation would be, just to go back to something that Kate Dodsworth said. She said of the consumer standards, these are only the basics and landlords will want to go much further. And I think that there's much food for thought there, because it's easy to start to regard the consumer standards as a full description of what you're about as a housing organisation, whereas in fact they should only be a lens with which you look at your organisation, because lots of different types of organisation could exist, from a focus on bricks and mortar through to a focus on community. And it's not the intention of the consumer standards to define everything that a housing organisation needs to do. I just fall back on what Kate said. These are only the basics. In terms of what a local authority might want to be doing at the moment, they'll want to be doing a self-assessment. They'll want to be doing an action plan that addresses any gaps. I really liked something that Paul from Birmingham had to say. He talked about transacting and assuring. So you're turning the wheels on the business, but you're also building your capability in assurance, so that you know that what you're setting out to achieve and appear to be achieving, that those statistics are built on solid foundations. For local authorities, a need to focus on governance. It's very different from RP world, and the regulators going to have to get their head around that, and it's going to be the job of local authorities to make it as easy as possible for the regulator to understand your governance approach and how you're gaining assurance within that. And that might be a slightly bumpy road, because the regulator's got lots of experience in RP land and only limited experience with local authorities. But lots of positive news about common ground, and an ability, therefore, to learn from good practice that applies across the whole of the sector.
Thank you, John. Kerry, let me come to you. It'd be interesting to hear how much read across there was to the Housing Association and Private Registered Providers group. Over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Catherine. So we likewise had two really interesting speakers with quite different things to talk about. Duncan from Vivid was talking about their experience of going through what will be one of the last IDAs, in-depth assessments, before it changes to inspections from the 1st of April, and was feeding back that the regulator had, perhaps unsurprisingly, brought in quite a focus on consumer regulation into that in-depth assessment, but without issuing a grading or giving any formal feedback, but there was some verbal feedback. And I think what I was particularly interested in relation to that was the fact that Vivid had identified some priorities for improvement, and could show a really good level of planning around those in a consistent thread through conversations in the governance structure through to business planning and investment plans to facilitate that improvement. And the regulator was clearly impressed by that, but was saying, but actually when we come and inspect, we'll be very much focused on the outcomes that you're actually achieving. And so that, I think, was interesting to hear. Duncan was also talking about, in response to some questions, the fact that they'd taken about 6 months probably to prepare for that IDA, including some external support. So obviously on the basis that they suspected an IDA would be coming up around about the time that it ultimately did. And then we heard from Jessie about some of the challenges that smaller providers might face when thinking about consumer regulation. In particular, being able to find good people, particularly to serve on boards. It can be a challenge for smaller organisations, even though we know there are some excellent people out there on the boards of smaller housing associations. And there were some good questions about how to upskill boards in that context. And then Jessie was talking about the National Housing Federation toolkit that we've worked on to help support smaller providers. And there was a question, Catherine, which you might be able to provide the answer to, about how people can access that and when it's going to be available. Don't know if you know the answer to that.
Well, I sort of know the answer to that. We're hoping it will go out this week, possibly next. It's been updated since the documents from the regulator were finalised, and we just want to make sure it's absolutely 100%, but just about ready to come out.
And is it through the National Housing Federation?
I'm sorry, yes, the NHS will circulate it to members of the smaller housing associations network, and then I believe it will be available on the website, for which you just need, NHS membership to log in and access.
Perfect. That's great. So people were really interested in that. And then we talked a bit about what Duncan and Jessie think is keeping boards in the sector awake at night. And they talked about health and safety, but also about customer engagement. So about how to make customer engagement, tenant engagement meaningful, and not just, so moving beyond just paying lip service to the regulatory standards, which obviously do set some expectations around customer engagement, but actually coming up with ways that work for the particular organisation and its customers. So yeah, some really interesting content from our speakers and some good questions.
Thanks both. And just replying to a question on the chat, so I got distracted slightly there. Yeah, I think the toolkit will be available to any NHF members, but it does specifically address some of the things that smaller housing associations have raised. 11:45, I can see a few more questions coming through. We will try and respond to those appropriate. I can see there's been a couple around kind of costs and the impact of the changes to the Ombudsman's complaints handling code, which we can pass on to Rick. In a moment, and I think you might have got it already, there will be a survey posted in the chat. We'd really, really appreciate your feedback, please, on how you found today, how we could improve it, and perhaps what you'd welcome in the future. Stepping back, though, I wanted to reflect on some of the key messages we've heard today. I think culture has got to come first of everything I've heard today. Yao, Rick, Kate all talked about how crucial it is to get the culture right. And I shall retain that point about having your values on your mugs and how you understand if the values are happening in practice. We heard a lot as well about the importance of good quality data. And sometimes when we're working with housing providers, whether local authority or housing association, we hear, gosh, are we a data business these days? It feels like we're spending a lot of time thinking about data quality, data integrity. And, you know, you do have to get that right. You need to have good quality data, and you need evidence that your property, your compliance, your people and your service data is correct. But you also need to use that data. And I think that's the message that came across for me really strongly from Rick in particular. You know, complaints is about more than the data on how many and how quickly you responded. It's about using that as a can opener. So numbers and timescales matter, of course, but also using that as a can opener to say, where do we need to be improving? Where do we need to be learning? As Yao said, look for the I in the KPI. What's the meaning for the tenants living in the homes you own and manage? We sometimes talk about the need for curiosity at board and councillor level, and that very much resonated with a lot of what I've heard today. Sometimes it's about asking the right questions as well as having the answers. That was very much reflected, I think, in terms of looking at complaints learning for what some of the read across is, perhaps some of the things Kate was talking about in terms of understanding who's behind the front doors, understanding your tenant base, and, you know, making meaningful decisions on the basis of that. Curiosity at board and councillor level to look for the evidence and to understand what's going on beyond the numbers is crucial. I'm going to echo something that John said about the standards being a baseline, not a measure of best practice. And, you know, Kate said very clearly and has said a few times, the regulator will not be publishing good practice. It would be a risk for them, I suppose, and it's not what they've been charged with doing. The consumer standards are intended to be, and I think largely achieve the ambition of being outcome focused, and it's for each individual organisation to steer its course and for boards and councils to gain assurance about what's happening on the ground. I think there is also a space for this kind of event and others for organisations to share good practice. And I hope we do continue to get together to share good practice, but also to share what's difficult. I want to really thank all of our speakers for being so generous with their experiences, you know, the difficult times and the good things that they've experienced. And in terms of key messages, I suppose I'd finish with Yao's well-made point, the importance of residents having an active seat, not just being involved to make up the numbers. So make it meaningful, make engagement meaningful, and make it about the impact, the so what question. I'll draw to a close now And I just want to thank again all our speakers who I think have made really fantastic contributions. I'd like to thank you all for attending. It's been fantastic to see so many of you this morning. If you would like to speak to one of us, please just take that option in the survey we presented in the chat. And finally, but absolutely not least, I want to just reflect that these events don't just throw themselves together, and there's been an enormous amount of work behind the scenes. And I'd like to thank our comms team, Zena, Rihanna and Zainab, for all your time and effort in putting together this event, in promoting it so successfully, and in running around behind the scenes this morning, which we've seen a little bit through messages flying to and fro, and hopefully you guys haven't seen too much, if at all. Look, we hope you found today really helpful. We will be in touch with a bit of a brief from today, also an updated free gap analysis, where you can just look at the final versions of the standards. If nothing else, it saves you typing them out and think about where you're compliant and where you may have gaps. Thanks again for joining us this morning. It's been a real pleasure to see so many of you.